Imagine the story of the Exodus from Egypt, of Moses, of God's law. Now imagine that the entire civilized world of that time saw this story in a completely different way. Today, we will dive into the earliest historical records of the Jewish people, not from the Bible itself, but from some of the greatest minds of ancient Greece. We will uncover a forgotten historical conspiracy that will overturn everything you think you know about events from thousands of years ago. Because before the Bible was translated into Greek, the Greeks had their own, completely false history of the Jews. And this history tells of colonists, a mysterious Egyptian priest, and an expulsion that has nothing to do with the miracle of the Exodus. It all begins with one of the greatest Greek travelers and historians, Herodotus. Around 425 BCE, he traveled the world to document foreign peoples and their customs. When he arrived in Egypt, he met with local priests who were his main sources of information. In his histories, he wrote about the Syrians of Palestine, who, according to him, practiced circumcision, a custom he claimed they learned from the Egyptians. Herodotus never mentioned the word Jews. To him, they were just one of many peoples in the region whose identity was entirely subordinate to their Egyptian influence. His colleague Aristotle dealt with even stranger stories, legends of a lake in Palestine where neither man nor animal could sink, likely the Dead Sea. Even his student, Clearchus of Soli, later claimed that Aristotle met a Jew in Asia Minor who impressed him with his wisdom. These accounts are extremely superficial, based on rumors and legends. They give us to understand that for the Greeks, the Jewish people were simply part of a larger, anonymous world whose history began in Egypt. But this was only the beginning of a great historical mystery. The next important voice to be heard is that of Hecataeus of Abdera, who wrote his work around 320 BCE. He was one of the most influential intellectuals at the court of Ptolemy I Soter, the first Hellenistic ruler of Egypt. Like Herodotus, Hecataeus also relied exclusively on Egyptian priestly sources. In one of his books, preserved by the later historian Diodorus Siculus, he makes a brief but important mention that the nation of the Jews, located between Arabia and Syria, was founded by colonists who came from Egypt. He even adds that they learned circumcision from the Egyptians. That sounds like a confirmation of Herodotus's words, don't you think? For the Greeks, the story was simple. The Jews were just one of many peoples who had split off from Egypt. In the eyes of the Hellenistic authorities, this was the official story. But why then does another, completely different account exist? This is where the real intrigue begins. In another passage, also in Diodorus Siculus's library, a completely different account of the origin of the Jews appears. And this account is also attributed to Hecataeus. Except this second fragment is incredibly detailed. It explicitly mentions Moses, describes him as a founder and lawgiver, and tells the story of the expulsion of foreigners from Egypt who settled in Judea under his leadership. But the most shocking thing is that this passage even contains a quote from the Book of Jewish Laws. This is a complete turnaround. In one passage, the Jews are simply anonymous colonists, in the other, a people with a great leader and a detailed written law. How is it possible for the same author to write two such contradictory stories? This contradiction has been the cause of long disputes among scholars and reveals something much deeper than a simple historical error. But this is not the only strange thing in the Greek chronicles. While historians were trying to understand the two fragments of Hecataeus, Theophanes, another student of Aristotle who wrote around 315 BCE, entered the scene. His writings offer an even darker and more provocative picture. Theophanes describes the Syrians, of whom the Jews are a part, as practicing pagan and heretical rituals. He speaks of night sacrifices of animals that are burned whole, and of the worship of stars. But the most disturbing is his claim that they sometimes even perform human sacrifices. The amazing thing about this account is that these practices are condemned precisely in the Jewish prophetic books, such as Jeremiah and Ezekiel, as pagan and forbidden. This revelation tells us that at that time, before the canon was fully established, there were heretical currents in the Jewish community that were visible to outside observers. Theophrastus did not witness what we think he did, but something much more complex and dark. And this leads us to unraveling the main mystery. For centuries, the second, extremely detailed fragment was considered proof that Greek writers knew about Moses and Jewish law. But modern science reveals a shocking truth. Historians are unanimous that this fragment is a forgery, written much later, likely by a writer named Theophanes of Mytilene, around 62 BCE. This conspiracy was a deliberate attempt to lend authority to Jewish history in the eyes of Greek intellectuals. Someone wanted to legitimize the Jewish diaspora by using the name of a respected historian like Hecatenus to give their story weight. This revelation turns everything upside down. It proves that ancient people were not afraid to use forgeries to control their history. But while someone was trying to write a favorable, albeit false history, others were creating extremely hostile accounts. Let's return to Egypt, where in 285 BCE, a priest named Manetho wrote a history of the Egyptians. And his account of the origin of the Jews is full of anger and contempt. According to Manetho, the Jews are no heroes of the Exodus. Instead, they are Hyksos, or shepherd kings, hated foreigners who had previously ruled Egypt. Later, during the time of Amenhotep and Ramses, he claims that a group of defiled Egyptians, led by a renegade priest named Osarseph, were expelled to Judea. In his account, Osarseph is equated with Moses. This is a direct and extremely hostile counter-narrative to the biblical account. Instead of being God's chosen people, the Jews are presented as unclean and banished. This story shows how deep the Egyptian contempt and dislike for the Jews was. And what about the Babylonians? The priest Berosus, who wrote around 278 BCE, used Babylonian cuneiform records to tell of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem. His account is simply a historical fact about a military conflict. Like other writers of that time, he shows no knowledge of Jewish scriptures. He tells of the Jews only in the context of his Babylonian chronicles. This shows that before the translation of the Septuagint, the Greek world was completely uninformed about the true nature of the Jewish scriptures. Now we will examine one of the most important, yet problematic historical texts, a passage from Diodorus Siculus that supposedly quotes Hecataeus of Abdera. But as we will reveal, this passage is so full of contradictions and doubts that most scholars consider it one of the most daring forgeries in antiquity. And uncovering the truth behind it could forever change the way we view the early history of the Bible. It all begins with a remarkable passage in the library of Diodorus Siculus. This text, which is of great length and is widely circulated, appears to quote Hecataeus of Abdera, a historian from the end of the 4th century BCE. What makes the passage so unique is its essence. It bears direct witness to Jewish writings that record the laws received by Moses from God. This is incredible. If true, it would mean that a Greek historian had access to the Pentateuch, or parts of it, at least several decades before Manetho, Berosus, and especially before the translation of the Septuagint. At that time, this would have been an event of extraordinary importance that would have completely changed the attitude of the Greek world toward the Jewish people and their faith. But unfortunately, it's too good to be true. The first and most serious problem with this passage is logic. If Hecataeus really had access to the Pentateuch, it means that a Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures existed. Such a thing would have been a huge historical event that would have left clear traces in history. But evidence for such a translation decades before the Septuagint is completely lacking. In fact, all the undisputed fragments of Hecataeus, found in the first book of Diodorus, show no knowledge of the existence of the Pentateuch. This creates a huge contradiction. How can a historian not know anything about the Pentateuch in one of his books, but in another quote directly from it? It simply doesn't add up. If one contradiction is not enough, here's a second. In the first book of Diodorus, Hecataeus repeatedly points to the Egyptian priests as the main sources of his information. For him, they were the only authorities. He never claims to have had contact with Jewish priests or to have had access to Jewish scriptures. He would hardly have failed to mention this if it were true, as it would have raised the authority of his work. But in none of the undisputed fragments do we find a word about such contact. This again leads us to the conclusion that either there were two different Hecataeuses or that one of the accounts is a forgery. Imagine that you find a passage in the history of Hecataeus that describes the Jewish people, Moses, and his laws in detail. Why did no one else who wrote about the Jews at that time quote it? Theophanes, who certainly read Hecataeus, describes completely different heretical practices. Manetho, who was also familiar with Hecataeus, reduced his knowledge of the Jews to their location and the name of Moses. Even the Alexandrian Jewish writers of the 2nd century BCE, who sought every opportunity to quote Greek classics, failed to find a single passage in which Hecataeus or any other early Hellenistic author quoted Jewish scripture. This complete lack of quotations and references from other authors is perhaps the strongest evidence that the passage simply did not exist at that time. We come to the most significant contradiction. The passage from Book 40 of Diodorus does not just differ, but completely contradicts the brief but undisputed passage from Book 1. In Book 1, Hecataeus presents the Jews as descendants of Egyptians and has a favorable attitude toward both the Egyptians and the Jews. In Book 40, however, the Jews are designated as non-Egyptians, foreigners expelled from Egypt. This passage even contains traditions that are moderately hostile to the Jews. It is impossible for the same author to have written both stories. He cannot have simultaneously considered the Jews as descendants of Egyptian colonists and as foreigners expelled from Egypt. After examining all these problems, it becomes clear that Hecataeus is not the author of this passage. But who is it then? Scholars discover that the passage is embedded in an account of events that took place between 74 and 62 BCE, namely the Pirate War and the subsequent campaigns of Pompey. The entire account of these events is derived from a single source, the biography of Pompey written by Theophanes of Mytilene. By all accounts, Diodorus was quoting Theophanes, who in turn was quoting Hecataeus. Due to this complex chain of quotations, and later, due to omissions on the part of Diodorus himself, the passage was mistakenly attributed entirely to Hecataeus.
Why is this so important? Because if these words belong to Theophanes, it means that the entire subsequent account is part of a larger text written by a man who was on the side of Pompey during the war against the Jews. This raises serious questions about the objectivity of the account. We will understand how this connection completely changes our understanding of the text and its purpose. The text of Diodorus consists of two completely contradictory versions of the origin of the Jews. The first version, attributed to Hecataeus of Abdera, describes how Egypt sent colonists all over the world, including to Judea. These colonists are described in an extremely positive light as founders of cities and new civilizations. According to Hecataeus, the Jews were sent from Egypt to colonize new lands. But immediately after this account, Diodorus presents a second, completely opposite version. It says that an epidemic broke out in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians blamed the foreigners living among them for the disaster and expelled them from the country. The Jews are presented as a group of expelled foreigners who were forced to leave Egypt. This account is in full accordance with another ancient source, Manetho, who describes the Jews as defiled foreigners driven out of Egypt. Why would Diodorus combine these two stories? The answer lies in the work of Theophanes of Mytilene. But first, who is Theophanes of Mytilene? To understand this complex story, we must go back to 63 BCE and meet a key character whose name is rarely mentioned, Theophanes of Mytilene. He was not a famous philosopher or military leader, but the court historian of one of the most powerful men in Rome, Gnaeus Pompey the Great. Together with Pompey, Theophanes traveled to Judea, where he had the unique opportunity to observe the lives of the Jews up close. Theophanes was more than just a chronicler. He was a curious observer who documented the daily life, customs, and culture of the people he met. It seems that Theophanes combined the positive account of Hecataeus with the negative account of Manetho to create a complex and contradictory image of the Jews. This is one of the first examples of the hybridization of historical accounts for the purpose of manipulation. A central figure in Diodorus' account is Moses, but here again we encounter a distortion of history. According to Diodorus, Moses was exceptional in both wisdom and courage. He is described as a typical Greek founder of a colony. He leads his people to an uninhabited land, founds Jerusalem, builds a temple, creates laws, and establishes political institutions. This version of Moses has nothing to do with the biblical account. The text mentions nothing about the slavery of the Jews in Egypt, their deliverance, the miracles associated with the Exodus, the 40 years in the desert, or the death of Moses before he entered the Promised Land. Why? Because this account was created in the mold of Greek myths about the founding of cities. Hecataeus, who probably heard about Moses as a lawgiver from Egyptian priests, concluded that since he was a lawgiver, he must also have been a founder of a colony. This was a typical Greek stereotype. It is interesting that Hecataeus knows about Mosaic law, but not Mosaic books. This suggests that in his time, the laws of Moses were mainly oral, not written in the Torah as we know them today. This fact is extremely important for dating biblical texts and their distribution in antiquity. The next detail we will examine is the division of the people into 12 tribes. The text of Diodorus explains that Moses divided the people into 12 tribes because this is the most perfect number and corresponds to the number of months in the year. At first glance, this sounds like the biblical story, doesn't it? But again, this is a misconception. Analyses show that Greek founders of colonies often divided their people into tribes. Plato, in his Laws, recommended 12 tribes as the ideal number. The Greeks also had so-called amphictyones, unions of 12 tribes around a common temple. So, while the division into 12 tribes is part of the biblical tradition, the way it is presented here is a typical Greek stereotype. This correspondence is more coincidental than based on knowledge of Jewish texts. Here again, we see how Theophanes or Hecataeus used familiar Greek concepts to fill the gaps in his understanding of Jewish history, making it more comprehensible and acceptable to a Greek audience. This is a classic example of cultural assimilation in a historical account. Perhaps the greatest breakthrough in this text comes from a passage that directly refers to the lack of images of gods in the Jewish temple. Diodorus writes that Moses forbade the making of images of gods because he believed that God was not in human form. But this passage could not have been written by Hecataeus, who lived 2 centuries earlier. Why? Because before 63 BCE, persistent rumors existed that the Jewish temple contained an image, for example, a golden head of a donkey or a statue of a man riding a donkey. These rumors were widespread and had Egyptian roots related to the god Typhon. Only when the Roman general Pompey the Great conquered Jerusalem in 63 BCE did he enter the temple and personally verify that it was empty. Pompey put an end to these rumors. Therefore, the passage that describes the lack of images must have been written after 63 BCE, i.e. by Theophanes of Mytilene. This is direct evidence that Diodorus did not use only Hecataeus, but combined earlier sources with much newer ones. And more importantly, this is evidence that the account was written to flatter Pompey and show that he had revealed the truth about the Jewish temple. Another extremely important passage in Diodorus' text is the claim that the Jews never had a king. Instead, according to the account, they were ruled by a high priest who was chosen for his wisdom and virtue. This claim is completely historically false, as the history of Judea is full of kings, from David to Alexander Jannaeus. Why would Theophanes write such a thing? Because this was part of Pompey's propaganda. At the time of the war, the Jews were ruled by kings, led by Alexander Jannaeus and his sons. After conquering Jerusalem, Pompey abolished the monarchy and replaced it with the rule of high priests, led by Hyrcanus II. The claim that the Jews were traditionally ruled by high priests was a way to justify Pompey's actions and legitimize his reforms. This shows that Theophanes' text was not simply a historical account, but a political document written to support the conquering ambitions of his patron. This is perhaps the clearest evidence of the political nature of this historical account. The culmination of our analysis comes with a final passage that contains a quote from Jewish scriptures. At the end of the account, Diodorus writes that the laws of the Jews end with the statement, "These are the words that Moses heard from God and proclaimed to the Jews." This is the first and one of the few instances when a Hellenistic author quotes Jewish scriptures. Why is this so important? Because if this passage is authentic and is from Hecataeus of Abdera, it would mean that part of the Pentateuch existed in written form as early as 320 to 315 BCE. However, the majority of scholars believe that this passage is also the work of Theophanes of Mytilene. The evidence is abundant, but the most convincing is that this passage shows broad knowledge of Jewish traditions, which is not seen in the other parts of the account that belong to Hecataeus. Theophanes, as part of Pompey's entourage, likely had access to Jewish documents, or at least to people who knew them. This is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that parts of Diodorus's text are based on direct observation, but were used in a larger propagandistic context. And so, we have unraveled the mystery. The text of Diodorus Siculus, which at first glance seems like an objective historical account of the Jews, is actually a complex collage of various sources. It contains positive and negative accounts, mythological Greek stereotypes, and contemporary political propaganda. And all of this is the work of one man, Theophanes of Mytilene, who wrote to support his patron, Pompey the Great. This example teaches us one of the most important lessons in history, that we should always be skeptical. We should always ask who wrote the story and for what purpose. Because history is not just a record of events. It is a narrative that has often been shaped, distorted, and manipulated by the powerful of the day.
So, what have we learned from this complex historical puzzle? Theophanes of Mytilene, Pompey's court historian, created one of the earliest and most important historical accounts of the Jews. This account is not uniform. It is a composite document that mixes three main sources. Theophanes' observations from 63 BCE, which give us a glimpse into the life of the Jews at that time. The anti-Semitic stories from Manetho, which describe the Jews as expelled foreigners. The utopian history of Hecataeus of Abdera, which describes Moses as an ideal Greek founder of a colony. Hecataeus, although he was the first Greek to mention the name of Moses, knew extremely little about Jewish history and traditions. His description of Moses is heavily influenced by Greek philosophy and political ideas, which makes him more of an idealized Greek hero than a biblical prophet. This analysis shows us that the story of Moses, as it was perceived by the ancient Greek world, was the result of complex cultural interactions and interpretations. It is not simply a copy of the biblical account, but a unique creation that is a reflection of the Greeks' own ideas about an ideal leader, state, and society. The next time you hear the story of Moses, remember Theophanes, Manetho, and Hecataeus. Remember that history is rarely what it seems at first glance. It is a mosaic of facts, myths, and traditions collected by different people with different goals. And the deeper we dig, the more amazing truths we discover. If you found this look at history interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.